Picture this, one of the largest Ork empires in the galaxy, controlling an area nearly as vast as Ultramar itself. Hundreds of billions of greenskins spread across dozens of worlds, all spoiling for a good fight. Now imagine someone deciding to point the largest Tyranid Hive fleet ever encountered directly at them. Not as an accident, not as a mistake, but as a deliberate, calculated military strategy. This is the story of the Octarius War, and it might be the single greatest miscalculation in Imperial history. The architect of this catastrophe was Inquisitor Kryptman, a man who had spent over 250 standard years fighting the Tyranid threat. He had witnessed horrors that would break lesser minds. He had seen entire worlds consumed down to bedrock, watched hive fleets turn thriving systems into lifeless husks, and studied the aliens with an obsession that bordered on madness. By 997.M41, when Hive Fleet Leviathan emerged from below the galactic plane, Kryptman was perhaps the Imperium's foremost expert on the Tyranid menace. But expertise and wisdom are not the same thing. Kryptman's logic was brutally simple. The Orks and Tyranids were both existential threats to humanity. The Orks had been the Imperium's enemies for 10,000 years, an endless green tide that could never be fully exterminated. The Tyranids were something newer, and perhaps even more terrifying, a hunger from beyond the galaxy that devoured everything in its path. Kryptman looked at these two threats and saw an opportunity. Why not let them fight each other? Why not engineer a collision between these two forces and let them grind each other to dust? The plan seemed perfect on paper. The Ork Empire of Octarius was vast and powerful, but ultimately disposable from an Imperial perspective. Hive Fleet Leviathan was inexorable and unstoppable, but perhaps it could be delayed or even destroyed if given a sufficiently challenging target. In the best-case scenario, both threats would annihilate each other. In the worst case, whichever side won would be so weakened that Imperial forces could mop up the survivors. What Kryptman failed to account for was the fundamental nature of both species. Orks don't get weaker from prolonged warfare. They get stronger. Every fight makes them bigger, tougher, and more dangerous. And Tyranids don't just fight and die. They adapt. They learn. They incorporate the strengths of their enemies into their own biology, becoming more deadly with every battle. The Octarius War has been raging for years now, and both sides are growing more powerful. Orks from light years around are drawn to the conflict like moths to a flame, eager to join what they see as the greatest fight in the galaxy. And with every Ork devoured, the Tyranids gain more biomass, more genetic material, more evolutionary potential. The war was supposed to solve a problem. Instead, it has created something far worse. Two enemies that are evolving and strengthening through constant battle with each other. When the dust finally settles, whichever side emerges victorious will be more powerful than either species has ever been before. And that victor will turn its attention back to the Imperium, with capabilities far beyond what they possessed before Kryptman's intervention. This is the story of how one man's desperate gambit to save humanity might instead have doomed it. To understand the Octarius War, you need to understand Kryptman. This wasn't some reckless junior inquisitor making impulsive decisions. This was a man with over 250 years of experience fighting the Tyranid threat. Someone who had dedicated his entire existence to understanding and combating the Great Devourer. Kryptman's history with the Tyranids stretched back to the very beginning. He was there when the Imperium first encountered them at the research station on Tyran, the facility whose destruction gave the species their name. He was one of the first to recognize them as a galaxy-scale threat rather than just another Xenos species. He warned Chapter Master Marnius Calgar before the First Tyrannic War, and helped coordinate the defense of Ultramar. He fought at Tarsus Ultra and witnessed firsthand the horrifying efficiency with which the Tyranids consumed entire worlds. But understanding your enemy can become a curse as much as a blessing. The more Kryptman learned about the Tyranids, the more he realized how inadequate the Imperium's responses had been. Conventional military doctrine was designed to fight opponents who thought, who made mistakes, who could be outmaneuvered or demoralized. The Tyranids were none of these things. They were hunger given form, an alien intelligence so vast and distributed that it could coordinate attacks across entire star systems with perfect precision. When Hive Fleet Leviathan appeared in 997 to M41, Kryptman knew immediately that this was different from Behemoth or Kraken. Where previous fleets had attacked from the eastern fringe, Leviathan emerged from below the galactic plane, its approach far more difficult to detect and counter. Its tendrils spread wide, forming what observers described as a massive pair of closing jaws that threatened to devour everything caught between them. Kryptman's response was radical even by inquisitorial standards. He implemented what became known as Kryptman's Cordon, a strategy of scorched earth on an interplanetary scale. He ordered exterminatus on dozens of worlds that lay in Leviathan's projected path. Not worlds that had already fallen to the Tyranids, but Imperial worlds still teeming with human life. His logic was coldly mathematical. Better to deny the Tyranids the biomass these worlds represented than to let them feed and grow stronger. The death toll was staggering. Billions of Imperial citizens were killed on Kryptman's orders. Entire planetary populations reduced to ash and slag. Some estimates suggest this was the largest deliberate genocide committed since the Horus Heresy itself. The Inquisitor justified it as a necessary evil, arguing that those billions were already doomed, and that their sacrifice might save trillions elsewhere. The Imperium's response was swift and damning. Kryptman was declared excommunicate traitoris, stripped of his rank and authority, branded a heretic and a traitor. The Carta Extremis was issued against him, essentially ordering his execution should he ever be captured. For the Inquisition to turn on one of its own in this manner spoke volumes about how controversial his actions had been. But before his exile, Kryptman had learned something crucial. He had observed a battle on the world of Tesla Prime, where Orks and Tyranids clashed by pure chance. The conflict had been extraordinarily brutal, with both sides fighting with a ferocity that exceeded their normal battlefield behavior. The Orks were energized by the challenge of facing such alien and dangerous opponents. The Tyranids adapted rapidly to Ork tactics, developing new bioforms specifically designed to counter greenskin warfare. It was this observation that planted the seed of what would become the Octarius Gambit. If Orks and Tyranids fought each other with such intensity when they met by accident, what would happen if such an encounter was deliberately engineered on a massive scale? The Ork Empire of Octarius was one of the most significant greenskin holdings in the Ultima Segmentum. This wasn't some minor Ork-held territory that the Imperium could afford to lose. This was an empire nearly as large as Ultramar, controlling dozens of worlds and commanding the allegiance of hundreds of billions of Orks. It had existed for thousands of years, a constant thorn in the Imperium's side, but never quite significant enough to warrant the massive military commitment that would be required to exterminate it. At the heart of the empire was the world of Octaria, a mountainous planet of snow-capped peaks and deep valleys where the Orks had built their ramshackle capital city of Gargates. The Ork ruler held the title of Overfiend of Octarius, a position that commanded respect even among other Ork warbands across the Segmentum. When Kryptman began planning his gambit, the Overfiend was a massive greenskin called Blaktoof, whose reputation for brutality and cunning was legendary even by Ork standards. The empire encompassed numerous other worlds, each with its own character and Ork populations. Orok was an industrial powerhouse covered in mechboys' workshops and scrap fortresses. Gorala sat amid a dense asteroid belt that the Orks had weaponized into a defensive minefield. Daragon, Keltor, Urmuk, Badsquig, Dakazot, each world contributed to the Empire's overall strength, providing warriors, weapons, and resources for whatever Wa'ag, the Overfiend, might choose to launch. This was the target Kryptman selected for his experiment. The execution of the gambit required resources and capabilities that only a rogue Inquisitor with loyal Deathwatch allies could muster. Kryptman's first challenge was obtaining live genostealers, the vanguard organisms that Tyranids use to infest new systems. These creatures are extraordinarily dangerous even by Xenos standards, fast, intelligent, and capable of implanting their genetic material in host organisms to create hybrid offspring loyal to the hive mind. Kryptman led several specially equipped Deathwatch teams into the caverns of Carpathia, where intelligence suggested a genostealer brood had established itself. The mission was successful, but the cost in lives was heavy. Deathwatch kill teams are among the Imperium's most elite warriors, and even they suffered significant casualties capturing the genostealers and containing them in stasis fields that prevented their escape. The next phase involved a space hulk called the Perdition's Flame, one of those massive conglomerations of wrecked ships that drift through the warp and occasionally emerge back into real space. These hulks are notoriously dangerous, often infested with genostealers or worse, but they also drift along relatively predictable trajectories once they emerge from the warp. Kryptman had tracked the Perdition's Flame as it materialized in a region that Hive Fleet Leviathan would pass through. He planted his captured genostealer brood aboard the Space Hulk, timing their release from stasis to coincide with the Hulk's closest approach to Leviathan's path. But a Space Hulk in motion is difficult to redirect without enormous force. That's where the Moon of Geist came in. Kryptman ordered the destruction of this moon, using its violent disintegration to alter the Hulk's trajectory directly toward the Octarius Empire. The results exceeded even Kryptman's calculations. As the Perdition's Flame drifted into Ork space, it was exactly what it appeared to be, a massive drifting collection of salvage and scrap. To the Orks, this was an irresistible treasure trove. Groups of Ork lootaz, those specialist looters who make their living salvaging wreckage, boarded the Hulk in search of valuable scrap to plunder. The genostealers were waiting for them. The ambush was swift and surgical. The lootaz never stood a chance. Within hours, they had been implanted with genostealer genetic material, turning them into unwitting carriers of an alien infection. When these Orks returned to their worlds, they brought the infestation with them. Within weeks, the genostealer cult had spread across the entire Octarius sector, establishing hidden broods on dozens of Ork-held worlds. The Orks' initial response was confused. Some warbosses recognized the threat and tried to organize defenses. The Blood Axes, always the most tactically minded of Ork clans, employed the services of Boss Zagstruk and his Vulture squad, elite Stormboys who specialized in rapid assault missions. Zagstruk's forces succeeded in destroying many of the initial genostealer infestations, but it was already too late. The psychic signal of the genostealer broods had already reached out into the warp, calling to the hive mind like a beacon. And Hive Fleet Leviathan, that vast swarm of living ships and hungry organisms, turned toward the signal like a predator scenting blood. A major tendril of the fleet altered course, abandoning its previous trajectory toward Imperial space and heading directly for the Octarius Empire. The Overfiend's response was characteristically Orky. Blaktoof didn't try to flee or negotiate or call for help. Instead, he launched a counter-invasion directly into the oncoming Hive fleet. Ork ships poured out of the Octarius worlds, forming a massive armada that intercepted Leviathan in the void between star systems. The space battle that followed was apocalyptic in scale, with bioships and Ork cruisers tearing each other apart in the darkness. But this was only the beginning. When the first Tyranid organisms made planetfall on Ork-held worlds, the real war began. Hive Fleet Leviathan was unlike the Tyranid threats the Imperium had faced before. Behemoth had been the first, arriving with shocking brutality that had nearly overwhelmed Ultramar before being stopped at great cost. Kraken had been more insidious, splitting into multiple tendrils that attacked across a broader front. But Leviathan was something else entirely. Massive, coordinated, and approaching from a direction the Imperium had never adequately defended. The fleet's approach from below the galactic plane meant that established warning systems and defensive networks were caught unprepared. Where previous Hive fleets had emerged from the eastern fringe where the Astronomican's light was weakest, Leviathan swept up from the galactic south, its two main tendrils forming what Imperial observers described as a massive jaw closing around entire sectors. The purple and white bioships emerged from the void by the thousands, blotting out stars and filling orbital space with alien life. What made Leviathan particularly dangerous was its synaptic network. The hive mind's control over this fleet was more sophisticated than anything previously encountered, allowing for coordination across vast distances and rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. Where Behemoth had relied largely on overwhelming numbers and Kraken on mobility, Leviathan combined both approaches with tactical flexibility that seemed almost intelligent by human standards. The first Ork world to face Leviathan's full fury was Ork. The planet's population of greenskins had received word of incoming bioships, but, being Orks, interpreted this as good news. Finally, a proper fight was coming to them instead of them having to go looking for it. When the skies darkened with millions of incoming mycetic spores, the Orks rushed to their weapons with enthusiasm rather than fear. The battle that followed was carnage on every conceivable scale. Thousands died in the first seconds as waves of gaunts crashed into Ork fortifications. The greenskins counter-charged with their characteristic lack of tactical subtlety, and the two species met in a collision that turned the battlefield into a charnel house. On every level of existence, a fierce struggle raged. Squigs and rippers tore into each other underfoot while Ork boys and gaunts hacked at each other with blade and claw. Ork war bosses traded blows with Tyranid warriors. Knobs found themselves facing carnifexes in brutal tests of strength. Mighty squiggoths, those massive Ork war beasts, battled thunderously against towering Tyranid bio-titans. What the Imperial observers who later studied the conflict found most disturbing was that the warfare extended even to the microscopic level. Tyranid phage cells actively sought out and consumed the aggressively spreading orkoid spores that allow orks to reproduce. This wasn't just a battle of armies or even organisms. It was a war of competing biological systems, each trying to establish dominance at every level of scale. Ork fell within weeks. The planet's biomass was consumed, processed through Tyranid digestion pools, and incorporated into new bioforms. But the Tyranids paid for their victory in numbers that would have broken a conventional military force. The Orks had fought to the last, and their resistance had cost Leviathan dearly. The next major engagement took place at Gorala, and here the nature of the war began to shift. When Leviathan's bioships approached, they faced an Ork fleet that had learned from Orok's fall. Warboss Scarfang commanded the defenses, and he had deployed extensive minefields hidden among Gorala's asteroid belt. The bioships blundered into these fields, and cataclysmic explosions tore them apart by the dozens. Ork gunships swarmed the survivors before they could react, and for a brief moment, it appeared the void battle would be a decisive Ork victory. But a single bioship broke through the blockade. Heedless of damage, ignoring the swarms of attack craft trying to stop it, the vessel hurled itself at Gorala and launched thousands of mycetic spores onto the planet's surface before being destroyed. The real fight, Scarfang realized, would happen planetfall. On Gorala's surface, the Tyranids found themselves vastly outnumbered for the first time since entering the Octarius sector. The initial landing force consisted of perhaps a few 100,000 organisms, facing Ork populations in the billions. Under normal circumstances, this would have been suicide. The hive mind recognized this and adapted its strategy accordingly. Instead of the mass assaults that had worked on Ork, the Tyranids adopted stalking tactics. They attacked only isolated Ork patrols, striking from ambush and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Lictors picked off stragglers. Genestealers erupted from unexpected angles. The swarm was learning that against an enemy this numerous, stealth and precision were more effective than brute force. The Orks, never ones for subtlety but capable of learning from experience, began traveling in mobs too large for the fledgling swarm to safely engage. This forced another adaptation. The Tyranids shifted to aiming for maximum carnage, engaging the Orks in open battle but always with an exit strategy. Whenever the swarm was on the verge of being overwhelmed, the organisms would retreat in perfect unison to caves or underground chambers, sheltering there until nightfall. Night on Gorala belonged to the Tyranids. Under cover of darkness, synapse creatures would gather the scattered organisms and lead them back to the battlefields to feed on the corpses left from the day's fighting. Ork and Tyranid bodies alike were devoured and dragged to digestion pools secreted in the planet's rocky mesas. Slowly but inexorably, the swarm gathered biomass and increased its numbers. Given time, the pattern suggested they would eventually reach a tipping point where their numbers became sufficient to overwhelm even Gorala's massive Ork population. Then the war reached Octaria itself, and the Overfiend decided it was time to make his stand. The defenses of Octaria were formidable even by Ork standards. The mountain world's natural terrain had been fortified over centuries, with gun emplacements covering every approach and massive accumulations of Ork warriors eager for battle. When the first wave of mycetic spores arrived, a great cheer went up from the assembled greenskin hordes. This was what they had been waiting for, a proper scrap on their home ground. The battle for Octaria began in the skies. So much ammunition was fired into the air by Ork quad guns and Flaka Daka guns that the rain was literally thickened by chunks of falling Tyranid flesh. Every gun on the planet seemed to be pointed upward, filling the atmosphere with enough ordnance to shred bioorganisms by the thousands. From the west, what appeared to be black storm clouds drew closer and closer until they resolved into massive swarms of gargoyles, their leathery wings blotting out what little sunlight reached through the smoke. Ork Defcoptus, Phyta bombers, and Stormboys roared into the air to meet them. The aerial battle that followed was spectacular and chaotic, with Ork pilots performing insane maneuvers while gargoyles swarmed them in numbers that defied easy counting. On the ground below, Ork boys began climbing mountain slopes, holding their choppas high and ready to leap into the fray if only they could reach the aerial combat. Then the ground burst open. Genestealer broods that had been lurking in Octaria's extensive tunnel systems erupted from below, flowing out of crevasses by the hundreds. But the Orks were ready. The green tide pushed back immediately, not just driving the Genestealers into their holes but plunging in after them for underground combat. The fighting spread into Octaria's caverns, turning the planet's depths into another battlefield. Meanwhile, lictors were demonstrating why they're among the most feared Tyranid organisms. These creatures scaled the mountainsides with horrifying speed and stealth, systematically silencing Ork gun emplacements. One by one, the massive artillery pieces fell silent as their crews were slaughtered by creatures they never saw coming. With the anti-air defenses compromised, the rain of mycetic spores doubled in intensity. More and more Tyranid organisms landed on the mountain passes, where they were met by equal numbers of Orks pouring out of defensive positions. Never before had Octaria seen such bloodshed. The war spread from the capital world throughout the entire Octarius sector as both sides poured more resources into what was rapidly becoming the largest conflict either species had fought in recent history. What Imperial observers watching from a safe distance began to realize was that the Octarius War was not following the trajectory Kryptman had predicted. Instead of one side overwhelming the other, the conflict had settled into a brutal equilibrium, where both species were not just surviving, but thriving. For the Orks, this was paradise. Greenskins don't just tolerate warfare, they live for it. Their entire biology is geared toward conflict. Orks grow larger and stronger through combat, their bodies responding to the stress of battle by producing more muscle mass and more aggressive behavior. An Ork who survives a dozen fights is noticeably bigger than one fresh off the spore. And in Octarius, every Ork was fighting constantly. Reports from Imperial reconnaissance indicated that Orks in the Octarius sector were growing to sizes rarely seen elsewhere. Standard Ork boys were reaching the proportions of knobs Knobs were growing into war bosses, and the war bosses themselves were becoming behemoths that rivaled the legendary orc leaders of previous millennia. The constant warfare was creating a generation of orcs that were bigger, meaner, and more dangerous than their counterparts elsewhere in the galaxy. But size wasn't the only change. The orcs were also getting smarter, or at least more tactically sophisticated. Facing an enemy as adaptable as the Tyranids forced even the relatively dim-witted greenskins to develop new strategies. Orc mech boys were designing weapons specifically to counter Tyranid bioforms. Pain boys were developing treatments for Tyranid toxins. Even orc tactics were evolving, with war bosses learning to coordinate their forces in ways that went beyond the typical charge forward and hit things approach. From the Tyranid perspective, Octarius represented an unprecedented feeding opportunity. Every orc killed was biomass that could be processed and incorporated into new organisms. But more than that, the hive mind was learning from every engagement. Tyranids that survived combat against orcs were incorporating genetic advantages specifically designed to counter greenskin physiology. The swarm was developing new bioforms and adapting existing ones to be more effective against this particular enemy. Intelligence reports described Tyranid organisms that were larger than typical, suggesting the biomass from consuming orcs was being used to create enhanced versions of standard creatures. There were also descriptions of entirely new bioforms that hadn't been seen in previous Hive Fleet engagements. Creatures with thicker armor to withstand orc weapons, more powerful jaws to penetrate orc hides, and toxic attacks specifically calibrated to affect greenskin physiology. The feedback loop worked both ways. As the orcs grew stronger, the Tyranids had to adapt more aggressively to counter them. As the Tyranids became more dangerous, the orcs were forced to fight harder, which made them grow even larger. The war was creating super-evolved versions of both species, each one pushing the other to greater extremes. This wasn't happening in isolation. The Octarius War was drawing attention from across the galaxy. For the orcs, word of the greatest fight anyone had ever seen spread like wildfire through the greenskin gestalt consciousness. Orc warbands from hundreds of light years away began making their way toward Octarius, eager to join what they saw as the ultimate scrap. This influx of fresh warriors meant the orc population in the sector was actually growing despite the horrific casualties they were suffering. Even the Eldar became involved, though their motivations were more complex than simple opportunism. Several craft worlds, recognizing that the conflict threatened to spread beyond its current boundaries, launched their own interventions. In 997.M41, multiple Eldar war hosts entered the war zone, though their objectives seemed focused more on containing the conflict than supporting either side. The Seamhan craft world was particularly active, using their superior mobility to strike at both Orc and Tyranid forces that threatened to break out of the Octarius sector. The Eldar operations forced the Imperium to take a more active role than Kryptman had originally envisioned. Imperial worlds caught in the crossfire found themselves defending against not just the primary combatants but also Eldar raiders, who seemed determined to prevent any expansion of the conflict. The Raven Guard, White Scars, and Salamander's chapters all deployed forces to defend embattled Imperial systems, creating a complex multi-way conflict where every faction was fighting multiple enemies simultaneously. Then, in 999 M41, the Great Rift tore open across the galaxy, and things got even more complicated. The massive warp storm that split the Imperium in half sent shockwaves through real space and the Imperium alike. One consequence was an unexpected intervention by Chaos forces. A World Eater's warband known as the Skull Hunt, led by the Cornate champion Voda Bloodprice, heard rumors of the massive bloodshed in Octarius and decided to investigate. What followed was called the Blood Crusade. Though it lasted only a brief period, the World Eaters attacked what they called Dama, apparently an orc world where particularly intense fighting was taking place. The Chaos Space Marines didn't care about strategic objectives or territorial control. They simply wanted to maximize the slaughter and offer the resulting skulls to their blood god. The fighting was intense, but relatively brief. The World Eaters were outnumbered by orders of magnitude, and while individually superior to either Orks or Tyranids, they couldn't sustain the casualties they were taking. But their intervention had an interesting effect on the broader conflict. Daemons offered no biomass to the Tyranids. Killing a daemon just sent it back to the warp rather than providing organic material to process. But Orks, with their ability to reproduce through spores scattered during combat, actually benefited from the three-way fighting. When the World Eaters eventually withdrew or were destroyed, the balance in Octarius had shifted slightly in the Orks' favor. They had grown stronger from the fighting, while the Tyranids had gained nothing from killing daemons. Observers tracking the conflict noted that this represented one of the few clear advantages the Orks had managed to secure since the war began. The arrival of the Swarmlord changed the character of the war. This creature, perhaps the Hive Mind's greatest creation, was a tactical genius incarnate, a being specifically designed to learn from defeat, adapt to any enemy, and eventually achieve victory no matter the cost. It had been the Swarmlord who orchestrated the near destruction of the Blood Angels at Baal. It had faced and defeated some of the Imperium's greatest champions, and now it was deployed to Octarius with a single objective: break the Ork Empire and consume its biomass. The Swarmlord's first engagement with the Overfiend became legendary throughout the sector. Blaktoof had heard the Tyranids were now being led by some supposedly unbeatable monster, and being an Ork, he naturally assumed this meant he should go find it and crush its skull. The two leaders met in combat on the ash wastes of Octaria, their forces clashing around them while they fought their personal duel. It was a brutal, grinding fight. The Swarmlord's 4 bone blades moved with precision that bordered on the supernatural, each strike calculated to exploit weaknesses in the Overfind's armor and stance. But Blaktoof was massive even by Ork standards, and he had survived decades of constant warfare through a combination of overwhelming strength and savage cunning. He soaked up punishment that would have killed lesser beings, and his power claw struck with enough force to crack ceramite and shatter bone. The duel ended when the Overfiend managed to close to grappling range. Despite the Swarmlord's attempts to maintain distance, Blaktoof's sheer momentum carried them together. The Overfind's power claw closed around the Swarmlord's head and simply crushed it. Then, with a roar of triumph, he ripped the creature's body in half. It should have been a decisive victory. The Overfiend had killed the Tyranid's greatest warrior in single combat. The Orks celebrated with typical enthusiasm, sure that this was the turning point in the war. But the hive mind simply spawned another Swarmlord. This is what made the creature so dangerous. It wasn't unique. It was a pattern, a template that the hive mind could reproduce whenever necessary. And each new iteration retained the memories and knowledge of its predecessors. The second Swarmlord knew exactly how the Overfiend fought, because it had experienced dying to him. It would not make the same mistakes. But the second Swarmlord also understood that defeating the Overfiend directly might not be the optimal strategy. Instead, it began a systematic campaign to weaken the Ork Empire before attempting another confrontation with its leader. This demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that went beyond simple battlefield tactics. This was campaign-level planning. The kind of long-term strategy that shouldn't be possible for what was essentially a living weapon. The Swarmlord began by targeting the smaller, less defended worlds of the Octarius Empire. Gorala, which had been hanging on through sheer Ork stubbornness, finally fell as the Swarmlord committed massive forces to its conquest. Keltor followed, then Daragon, then Orok for a second time after the Orks had attempted to recolonize it. Each fallen world added to the Tyranid biomass pool, allowing the swarm to grow larger and more numerous. Badsquig, a world infamous for its aggressive native squig populations that the Orks had domesticated and weaponized, posed a particular challenge. The planet was home to numerous beast snagga clans, Orks who specialized in hunting the most dangerous creatures they could find. These Orks were tougher and more cunning than standard boys, and they fought with a ferocity that impressed even the Tyranids. The beast snaggas were led by a warboss called Gragnat Stompkrumpa, whose reputation for monster hunting was legendary. He had personally killed everything from Amble queens to Catachan devils, and he saw the Tyranids as just another species of especially dangerous game. His tactics relied on traps, ambushes, and the use of trained squig packs to corner and overwhelm individual Tyranid organisms. The Swarmlord's response demonstrated why it was so dangerous. Instead of simply throwing more organisms at the problem, it developed specific counter-tactics designed to neutralize the beast snaggas' advantages. New bioforms emerged with blood so toxic that squigs became violently ill after biting them. Lictors adapted to hunt the hunters, stalking Ork ambush parties and killing them before they could spring their traps. The swarm even developed what appeared to be its own version of pack hunting tactics, with groups of warriors coordinating to isolate and eliminate beast snagga kill teams. Gragnats himself fell when he attempted to set a trap for what he thought was a lone carnifex. The creature turned out to be bait, and when he closed in for the kill, a dozen lictors emerged from concealment. He died fighting, taking 3 of them with him, but his death demoralized the beast snaggas and led to Bad Squig's eventual fall. With each world that fell, the strategic situation became clearer. The Swarmlord was not trying to defeat the entire Ork Empire at once. It was systematically removing the Overfiend's support structure, isolating Octaria itself before launching the final assault. The approach suggested learning from previous Tyranid defeats. Brute force assaults had failed against other well-defended targets, so the Swarmlord was using a more sophisticated campaign strategy. The final confrontation for Octaria came after months of preparation. The Swarmlord committed hundreds of Bio-Titans to the offensive, an expenditure of biomass that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. These massive creatures, each one a living engine of destruction, advanced on Octaria's defenses in coordinated waves that spoke to unprecedented levels of hive mind control. But the Bio-Titans were just the vanguard. The Swarmlord employed a dual swarm strategy that demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking. The first megaswarm, consisting of millions of organisms ranging from gaunts to carnifexes, was directed to surround the main Ork defensive positions and engage them in direct combat. This wasn't meant to be the killing blow. It was meant to fix the Orks in place and prevent them from maneuvering. While the first swarm held the Orks' attention, the second megaswarm moved to establish a blockade around the planet. Thousands of bioships took up positions that prevented any reinforcements from reaching Octaria, and, more importantly, prevented the Orks from escaping. The Swarmlord was making it clear. This would be a fight to the finish. The scale of forces committed was staggering. Carnifexes, those living battering rams that normally served as shock troops, were expended as though they were mere gaunts. Molochs burrowed through Octaria's mountains to attack from unexpected angles. Tyrant guards, normally reserved to protect hive tyrants, were thrown into the meat grinder in massive numbers. The Swarmlord was willing to pay any price in biomass to achieve victory, because it understood that conquering Octaria would provide enough resources to replace everything spent and more. The Overfiend responded with characteristic Ork aggression. He led a massive counter-assault, personally commanding a force of gargants and super-heavy war engines, supported by hundreds of thousands of boys eager to die gloriously in battle. The fighting that followed turned entire regions of Octaria into charnel landscapes where the ground itself was composed more of bodies than soil. But the Swarmlord's strategy was working. The sheer number of Tyranid organisms began to bog down even the Orks' super-heavy walkers. Gargants found themselves surrounded by swarms of smaller creatures that climbed their legs and attacked weak points in their armor. Ork infantry formations were isolated and destroyed piecemeal. Slowly but inexorably, the Overfind's forces were being separated and destroyed. The critical moment came when the Overfind found himself cut off from his elite Scarboy's bodyguard. The swarm had divided his forces deliberately, creating gaps that seemed like opportunities for counterattack but were actually killing zones. When Blaktoof charged forward to break through to his separated warriors, he ran directly into a Carnifex that had been specifically positioned for this purpose. The Carnifex didn't try to win the fight. It was already dying from accumulated damage. Instead, it grappled the Overfiend and held him in place just long enough for its talons to score a deep wound across his thigh. Then it died, but the damage was done. The Overfiend was wounded and slowed, his mobility compromised at exactly the moment when he needed it most. The Swarmlord emerged from the swarm like death itself. This time there would be no charging contest of strength. The creature had learned from its previous death. It moved with calculated precision, always staying just out of the Overfiend's reach, its bone blades darting in to score wounds before retreating again. This was not how orcs fought. They preferred direct confrontation and tests of strength. But the Swarmlord didn't care about orc preferences. The fight was methodical and brutal. The Swarmlord targeted the Overfiend's wounded leg repeatedly, cutting deeper each time, reducing his mobility even further. It waited for the perfect opening, and when the Overfiend committed to a massive overhead swing with his power claw, the Swarmlord struck. One bone blade severed the hydraulic cables that powered the claw, rendering it useless. The other 3 blades smashed through the Overfiend's head with surgical precision. Then, in a gesture that was almost certainly symbolic, the Swarmlord consumed Blaktoof's brain. The hive mind was making a point. The Ork Empire's greatest warrior had not just been defeated, but absorbed, his genetic material now part of the swarm. Within hours, Octaria fell. Without the Overfiend's leadership, the Ork defenses collapsed into the kind of disorganized brawling that individual Tyranid organisms could exploit. The planet was consumed, its biomass processed through digestion pools and converted into new bioforms. But the victory was not as complete as it might appear. No fewer than 6 separate warlords immediately declared themselves the new Overfiend of Octarius. The Empire fragmented as these rivals fought each other as enthusiastically as they fought the Tyranids. Ork infighting increased dramatically, with entire clans switching sides or launching their own expeditions to prove their dominance. Paradoxically, this fragmentation meant more orcs spreading outward from the Octarius sector. As rival war bosses fled from stronger competitors or launched Wa'az, to establish their credentials, they carried the war to neighboring systems. The Imperium found itself dealing with orc incursions far from Octarius itself, many led by greenskins who had been hardened by years of fighting the Tyranids. Meanwhile, the Tyranids were detaching strengthened elements from the Octarius combat zone and deploying them elsewhere. Bioforms that had evolved to fight orcs were proving extremely effective against other opponents. The swarm was stronger than it had been when it entered Octarius, not weaker as Kryptman had predicted. Into this already chaotic situation came the most infamous orc warlord in recent galactic history, Ghazghkull Thraka. The dating of Ghazghkull's arrival in the Octarius sector is somewhat unclear due to conflicting Imperial records. Most sources place it around 999.m41, though some documents reference what appears to be a transcription error listing it as 694999.m41. Given that Ghazghkull's departure from the Third War for Armageddon is well documented as occurring in 998.m41, the later date is almost certainly correct. Ghazghkull had grown bored with Armageddon. This sounds absurd. The Third War for Armageddon was one of the largest conflicts in the Imperium's recent history, a world-spanning battle that had consumed billions of lives. But for Ghazghkull, who had experienced visions he interpreted as divine messages from Gork and Mork themselves, Armageddon had become too small. He wanted something bigger. He wanted to unite every orc in the galaxy under his leadership and launch a Wa. that would never end. When word reached him of the Octarius War, Ghazghkull recognized it as the perfect proving ground. Here was a conflict that was producing the biggest, strongest orcs anyone had seen in recent memory. If he could take control of these warriors and add them to his forces, he would have the nucleus of the greatest Wa'a. In millennia, his arrival was dramatic. Kilreka, his massive flagship, dropped out of the warp in the territory controlled by an orc warlord named Urgok the Slayer. Urgok had built a reputation as one of the toughest bosses in the region, but he made the mistake of challenging Ghazghkull to single combat. The fight was brief and decidedly one-sided. Ghazghkull killed Urgok and immediately absorbed most of his forces. But the incident that truly cemented Ghazghkull's legend in Octarius happened during one of the battles against the Tyranids. A super Moloch, one of those massive burrowing organisms that can swallow entire vehicles whole, erupted from beneath Ghazghkull's position. The creature's jaws closed around him, and it pulled him underground. Most organisms consumed by a Moloch die from the combination of crushing pressure and digestive acids. Ghazghkull, being Ghazghkull, simply cut his way out. Witnesses reported seeing him emerge from the dying Moloch's corpse covered in acid burns and impaled by several of the creature's internal spines. The wounds would have killed any normal orc. In fact, they would have killed most space marines. Ghazghkull required assistance from his pain boys, who used buzzsaws and a deft dread with magna clamps just to remove the spines embedded in his body. According to orc accounts, he was back on his feet and fighting normally within an hour or two, suffering what they described as a slight headache from the experience. The story spread through the orc population like wildfire. Here was proof that Ghazghkull was truly favored by Gork and Mork. He could not be killed, not even by being eaten alive by one of the deadliest Tyranid bioforms. Ghazghkull declared himself the prophet of Gork and Mork, claiming he had been chosen by the orc gods to unite all greenskins in a great Wa'ag. That would consume the entire galaxy. Orcs from light years around began flocking to Octarius to join him, drawn by his reputation and the promise of endless warfare. The influx of fresh warriors meant the orc population in the sector began growing at rates that defied Imperial projections. The sources conflict somewhat regarding Ghazghkull's ultimate impact on the Octarius War. Some older accounts suggest he killed all the Tyranids on Octarius and achieved decisive victory. However, more recent sources from the Warzone Octarius campaign books paint a different picture, depicting the Swarmlord's defeat of the Overfiend as a major Tyranid success. What appears most consistent with the available evidence is that Ghazghkull didn't stay to see the war through to conclusion. Instead, he used Octarius as a recruiting ground and propaganda tool. After rallying massive numbers of orcs to his cause and establishing his legend through various heroic, or at least explosively violent deeds, he departed the sector. When Ghazghkull left Octarius, he took with him a fleet estimated at 5 million ships. This number is so staggering that it strains credibility, but multiple independent sources cite it. If accurate, it represents perhaps the largest orc armada assembled in 8,000 years, comparable to the forces commanded by the legendary beast during the War of the Beast in the 32nd millennium. The departure of such a massive force didn't end the Octarius War, but it did change its character. The Tyranids continued their advance, and the remaining orc forces continued to resist, but neither side achieved the kind of decisive breakthrough that might end the conflict. The war ground on, consuming resources and lives in numbers that became increasingly difficult for Imperial observers to track accurately. The Imperium's response to the ongoing catastrophe in Octarius evolved over time. Initially, there had been a degree of satisfaction that two major Xenos threats were fighting each other. But as it became clear that both sides were growing stronger rather than weaker, Imperial strategists realized they had a new problem. They needed to prevent whichever side won from exploding outward into Imperial space. The containment strategy was organized by Inquisitor Nashir Sahanson, an older member of the Ordo Xenos who brought very different sensibilities than Kryptman had possessed. Where Kryptman had been a warrior scholar focused on understanding and defeating the Tyranid threat through any means necessary, Sahanson was more of a traditional strategist concerned with maintaining Imperial territorial integrity. He had been a brawler in his youth, but wounds sustained from fighting Hrud, those time-warping Xenos whose very presence ages those around them, had left him physically disabled and forced him to develop tactical expertise instead of relying on martial prowess. Sahanson's strategy, which became known as the Cordon Impenetra, involved establishing a spherical perimeter around the entire Octarius conflict zone. This was easier to plan than execute. Space is three-dimensional, and establishing a true spherical perimeter requires enormous resources spread across vast distances. But Sahanson had Imperial authority and the full backing of the Inquisition, and he used both to requisition forces from across the segmentum. Imperial Guard regiments were deployed to garrison key systems along the perimeter. The Death Corps of Krieg, those grim warriors who seemed almost eager to die for the Emperor, were particularly active in subterranean warfare against Ork and Tyranid forces that attempted to burrow through defensive positions. Deathwatch kill teams operated as rapid response forces, intercepting incursions before they could establish themselves beyond the perimeter. The Black Templars chapter committed substantial forces to the containment effort. High Marshal Helbrecht personally led several campaigns, most notably the destruction of the Ork warboss World Killa, whose name alone suggested the level of threat he posed. The Black Templars' crusading nature made them well suited to the kind of extended campaign that the containment effort required, and their hatred of Xenos gave them extra motivation to ensure no Ork or Tyranid escaped the Octarius zone. Space Marine chapters played crucial roles throughout the containment efforts. The Raven Guard specialized in stealth operations, conducting reconnaissance missions deep into the conflict zone and sabotaging key enemy assets. The White Scar's mobile warfare doctrine made them ideal for intercepting fast-moving Ork raids attempting to break through the perimeter. The Salamanders, with their focus on protecting civilians and their mastery of flame-based weapons, defended Imperial worlds that found themselves on the edges of the expanding war zone. These weren't just hypothetical threats. Imperial worlds were genuinely caught in the crossfire. Some planets found themselves hosting refugees fleeing from both Orks and Tyranids. Others became battlegrounds when fighting spilled over from the designated combat zone. The human cost of maintaining the containment cordon was significant, measured in millions of Imperial Guard casualties and dozens of destroyed or heavily damaged worlds. The Eldar continued their own operations throughout the region, though their objectives remained somewhat opaque to Imperial observers. The Siamhan craft world was particularly active, conducting what appeared to be bio-purging operations on worlds along the front lines. These Eldar would appear, eliminate all biological material on a planet using their advanced technology, and disappear again before Imperial or enemy forces could respond. The implication seemed to be that they were trying to deny biomass to the Tyranids, but their methods also killed any Imperial citizens who hadn't been evacuated in time. The most disturbing reports coming out of the containment operations described organisms that appeared to be products of the Octarius War's unique evolutionary pressures. Orks captured during containment operations were demonstrably larger and more aggressive than those encountered elsewhere. Tyranid specimens showed adaptations specifically designed to counter Ork physiology and tactics, but these same adaptations made them more dangerous against human forces as well. Imperial biologists adepts studying captured Tyranid organisms reported concerning findings. Some creatures displayed what appeared to be Ork-derived genetic sequences incorporated into their structure. The hive mind was quite literally learning from the Orks it consumed, taking their genetic advantages and incorporating them into the swarm. The prospect of Tyranids with Ork resilience and regenerative abilities was nightmare fuel for anyone who understood the implications. The Octarius War continues to this day, a grinding conflict that has consumed an entire sector and threatens to spread beyond its current boundaries regardless of all containment efforts. Whichever side eventually emerges victorious will be more powerful than either species has been in recent history. And that victor will inevitably turn its attention toward the Imperium. From a certain perspective, Kryptman's gambit did achieve some of its objectives. Hive Fleet Leviathan was successfully diverted from its original course toward heavily populated Imperial space. The fleet's strength has been substantially depleted by years of fighting Orks. Thousands of bioships have been destroyed, millions of organisms consumed in the meat grinder of Octarius. Without Kryptman's intervention, those same forces would likely have been attacking Imperial worlds instead. But the cost of this diversion is almost impossible to calculate. An entire sector has been effectively sacrificed, its Ork and Tyranid populations growing stronger through constant warfare. The super-evolved organisms emerging from Octarius represent new levels of threat that the Imperium is poorly equipped to handle. Orks that have been fighting Tyranids for years are larger, tougher, and more tactically sophisticated than standard greenskins. Tyranids that have been consuming Ork biomass have incorporated genetic advantages that make them more resilient and more dangerous. The Octarius War has also created a beacon that draws both species from across the galaxy. Orks continue to flock toward what they see as the ultimate fight, the greatest scrap in living memory. The promise of endless combat is irresistible to the greenskin psyche. Every Ork who arrives adds to the sector's population and brings with them their own weapons, vehicles, and capacity for violence. The Tyranids, meanwhile, continue to commit additional forces to the sector. New tendrils from Hive Fleet Leviathan are being redirected toward Octarius, drawn by the massive concentration of biomass and the psychic signal of constant warfare. What started as a deliberate diversion has become something more like a black hole, pulling in resources from both species and creating an ever-expanding vortex of violence. The fundamental problem with Kryptman's strategy was its assumption that warfare would weaken both sides. This might be true for humans or most other species, where prolonged conflict depletes resources and demoralizes populations. But Orks and Tyranids don't work that way. For Orks, warfare is not depletion but growth. They literally become stronger through fighting. For Tyranids, warfare is not loss but gain. They consume their fallen enemies and incorporate their advantages. The Imperium now faces a dilemma with no good solutions. If they intervene militarily to try to end the war, they risk becoming another combatant in a three-way conflict where every casualty makes the other side stronger. If they maintain the containment strategy, they commit enormous resources to an essentially defensive posture, while both enemy forces continue to evolve and strengthen. And if they do nothing, they guarantee that eventually one side will win and emerge as a threat far greater than what existed before. Some Imperial strategists have quietly suggested that the best outcome might be if the war never ends, a permanent stalemate that keeps both threats occupied indefinitely. But this seems increasingly unlikely as both sides commit more resources and develop new strategies. The Octarius War feels like it's building towards some kind of resolution, and that resolution will almost certainly be catastrophic for Imperial interests in the region. The legacy of Kryptman's gambit remains contested. His supporters argue that he bought the Imperium precious time and diverted a fleet that would have otherwise consumed hundreds of Imperial worlds. His detractors point out that he may have created something worse than what he tried to prevent. Two super-evolved Xenos species that will eventually emerge from Octarius ready to tear through whatever stands in their path. What's undeniable is that the Octarius War represents one of the largest ongoing conflicts in the current galaxy. Millions die every day in fighting that spans dozens of worlds. Entire planetary ecosystems have been reduced to barren rock by the intensity of the combat. And through it all, both sides continue to grow stronger, locked in a spiral of violence and evolution that shows no signs of ending. The war serves as a reminder of something the Imperium often forgets. Human cunning and strategy have limits. You cannot always outthink your enemies or manipulate them into destroying each other. Sometimes, the most brilliant plan can backfire in ways you never anticipated. And sometimes, trying to be clever just makes the problem worse. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But some wars are more catastrophic than others. And the Octarius War, born from one man's desperate attempt to save humanity by sacrificing a sector, might ultimately prove to be one of the most consequential conflicts in recent Imperial history. Not because of who wins or loses, but because of what both sides will have become by the time the fighting finally ends. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of 40K's most fascinating ongoing conflicts, make sure to like and subscribe. There's so much more to explore in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and we're just getting started. Until next time, remember, in the 41st millennium, even your victories might doom you.